She returned with a baby and the dog he left behind. Then the cowboy said, "Stay if it still forgives me." But what happened next would change everything he thought he knew about love, forgiveness, and second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust swirled around Jake Morrison's boots as he stood frozen on the porch of the ranch house he once called home. 3 years had passed since he'd walked away from everything that mattered, chasing dreams that turned to ash in his hands. Now, watching the familiar red pickup truck pull into the gravel driveway, his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged animal. The engine cut, and silence settled over the Montana Valley like a heavy blanket. Through the windshield, he could see her silhouette, unchanged yet somehow different. Sarah's auburn hair caught the late afternoon sun the same way it had the morning he left, but there was something in her posture that spoke of burdens he'd never seen her carry. The truck door creaked open, and she stepped out slowly, deliberately. That's when Jake saw him. A baby, maybe 18 months old, with golden curls that danced in the mountain breeze. The child clutched a small, stuffed horse, his wide eyes taking in the vast landscape with wonder. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The timing, the resemblance around the eyes, the way the boy's small hand gripped Sarah's finger with trust and love. But it was the second passenger that nearly brought Jake to his knees. From the back seat emerged Ranger, the German shepherd he'd raised from a pup, the loyal companion he'd abandoned along with everything else when pride and foolish ambition had driven him away. The dog's coat was grayer now, his movements slower, but his eyes held the same intelligence, the same unwavering devotion that had once made Jake feel like he could conquer the world. Ranger's head lifted, nostrils flaring as familiar scents reached him across the distance. His ears perked forward, and for a moment, time suspended itself like morning mist over the pasture. Then recognition sparked in those dark eyes, and the dog's tail began a hesitant wag, as if afraid to hope, afraid to believe what his senses were telling him. Sarah lifted the boy to her hip, her movements careful and protective. She hadn't looked toward the house yet, hadn't acknowledged Jake standing there like a ghost from her past. Instead, she focused on gathering a small diaper bag from the truck, her attention seemingly consumed by the mundane task of organizing their arrival. Jake wanted to call out, wanted to bridge the terrible gap between them with words, but his voice had deserted him. What could he possibly say? How do you apologize for choosing a mirage over reality? How do you explain that every sunrise for 3 years had been a reminder of the home you abandoned, the woman you left behind, the dog that had looked for you at the gate every evening until hope finally died? The boy in Sarah's arms began to fuss, tiny hands reaching toward the house with the instinctive recognition that children possess. Home. Even at his tender age, something deep inside him understood that this place, these walls, this land, held significance beyond his ability to comprehend. Ranger took a tentative step forward, then another, his loyalty warred with uncertainty, love battling with the memory of abandonment. Jake could see the conflict in every line of the dog's body, the way his tail wagged low and cautious, the way his steps slowed as he approached the porch steps. Sarah finally looked up, her green eyes finding Jake's across the distance that separated them. No surprise registered on her face, no shock or anger or joy. Just a quiet resignation, as if she'd known he would be here. As if some part of her had been preparing for this moment since the day she'd received word that his big city dreams had crumbled into dust and debt. Sarah. The word escaped him like a prayer, rough and broken from disuse. 3 years of silence, 3 years of words unsaid, and her name was all he could manage. She adjusted the boy on her hip, her free hand smoothing down his golden curls with practiced tenderness. Jake. Her voice carried the weight of seasons past, of nights spent alone, of decisions made in solitude. We need to talk. Ranger had reached the porch steps now, his noble head tilted up toward the man who had once been his whole world. The dog's eyes held questions that would never find voice, forgiveness that Jake wasn't sure he deserved, and a love so pure it made his chest ache with shame and gratitude. I know you do. Jake's voice cracked as he spoke, years of regret condensing into those simple words. He took a step down from the porch, then another, until he was kneeling at eye level with the dog that had waited for him long after everyone else had given up hope. Ranger's tail wagged faster now, his body trembling with the effort of restraint. Jake extended his hand slowly, palm up, the same gesture he'd used when Ranger was a puppy learning to trust. The dog's wet nose touched his fingers. Then his whole muzzle was pressed against Jake's palm, warm breath and unconditional forgiveness flowing between them like a river finding its course. "He never forgot you," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying across the small space between them. Every truck that turned down this road, every sound at night, he would run to check. Hoping. Jake's fingers found the familiar spot behind Ranger's ears, the place that had always made the dog lean into his touch with pure contentment. "I'm sorry, boy. I'm so sorry." The baby in Sarah's arms had grown quiet, watching this reunion with solemn interest. His small face was serious beyond his years, as if he understood the gravity of the moment playing out before him. Jake caught the child's gaze and felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went deeper than logic or reason. "What's his name?" Jake asked, though part of him already knew, had known from the moment he saw those familiar eyes looking back at him from a face that carried echoes of his own features. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Thomas," Sarah replied, her voice soft but steady. "Tommy. He'll be 2 in September." September. Jake's mind worked backward through the calendar, through the mathematics of love and time and consequence. 2 years old in September meant conception in December, which meant their last night together, the night before he left, the night when desperation and need had overwhelmed good sense and broken promises. Tommy, named for Jake's grandfather, the man who had built this ranch with his bare hands and taught a young boy that a man's word was his bond, that the land would provide if you treated it with respect, that love was not a feeling but a choice made new each day. "He's mine," Jake whispered, the words not a question but a statement of recognition, of acceptance, of a truth that had been written in the child's eyes from the moment Jake first saw him. Sarah nodded, her grip tightening protectively around her son. "He's ours," she corrected, her voice carrying both an acknowledgement and a warning. "But you lost the right to claim him the day you walked away." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, deserved and devastating. He remained kneeling beside Ranger, the dog's warm presence, the only anchor keeping him grounded in the face of this revelation. A son. He had a son. A beautiful, perfect child who had spent his entire life without a father because Jake had been too proud, too foolish, too convinced that the grass was greener somewhere else. Ranger pressed closer against Jake's leg, as if sensing his emotional turmoil and offering what comfort he could. The dog's loyalty had never wavered, never questioned, never demanded explanations or apologies. It simply existed, pure and steadfast as mountain stone. "I know," Jake managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I did, but I'm here now. I'm here, and I'm not leaving again." Sarah's laugh was short and sharp, devoid of humor. "You're not leaving again. Just like that? You think showing up here makes everything okay? You think sorry fixes 3 years of silence? 3 years of wondering if you were alive or dead? 3 years of raising your son alone, while you chased whatever it was you thought was more important than us?" Tommy began to fuss again, picking up on the tension in his mother's voice. Sarah bounced him gently, her movements automatic, practiced from countless nights of soothing him through tears and fears and the 1,000 small crises that make up a child's world. Jake watched, memorizing every detail, storing up images of the life he'd missed, the moments that could never be reclaimed. "No," he said finally, rising slowly to his feet. Ranger stayed close, pressing against his legs as if afraid Jake might disappear again. "I don't think sorry fixes anything. I don't think showing up erases what I did, but I'm hoping, I'm praying, that maybe it's not too late to start trying." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and cattle, and the promise of rain on the horizon. This land, this place, it had shaped Jake's bones and blood, had given him everything he needed to be happy. But he'd been too young, too restless, too convinced that happiness lay somewhere else, in some other life that glittered with false promises. Los Angeles had chewed him up and spit him out, left him broken and empty, and finally wise enough to understand what he'd thrown away. The music career that had seemed so important, so vital, had crumbled under the weight of industry politics and his own naive expectations. The recording contract had evaporated, the band had dissolved, and Jake had found himself alone in a city of millions. surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than another failed dreamer. But it wasn't the failure that had finally brought him home. It wasn't the empty bank account or the repossessed guitar or the eviction notice that had forced him to swallow his pride and return to Montana. It was the letter. Sarah's letter, forwarded through 3 different addresses before finally reaching him in a motel room outside Bakersfield, had been brief and to the point. No accusations, no demands, no pleas for his return. Just a simple statement of fact. She was selling the ranch. His grandfather's ranch, the land that had been in the Morrison family for 4 generations, would be auctioned to pay the debts that had accumulated in his absence. She hadn't mentioned Tommy in the letter, hadn't told him about the son he'd never known existed. She'd simply given him the date of the auction and left the choice to him. Come home and fight for what mattered, or let it all slip away into the hands of strangers. Jake had made his choice, spending his last $100 on a bus ticket that brought him back to a place he should never have left. But he'd arrived too late to stop the sale, too late to save the ranch that had been his birthright and his betrayal. The new owners, a development company from Denver, had plans to subdivide the land, to turn rolling pastures into strip malls and parking lots. But Sarah was still here. Sarah and Tommy and Ranger, the remains of the family he'd abandoned. They were staying in the old foreman's house, the small cabin where Jake's grandfather had lived when he first claimed this land. It wasn't much, but it was home, and it was all they had left. "The house is gone," Sarah said, following his gaze toward the main ranch house where he'd grown up, where he'd dreamed of raising his own children someday. "Sold along with everything else. We've got until the end of the month to clear out of the cabin." Jake nodded, the full weight of his losses settling on his shoulders like stones. The house, the land, the life he'd imagined returning to, all of it was gone, sacrificed on the altar of his selfish ambitions. But looking at Sarah, at the son he'd never held, at the dog who still believed in him despite everything, Jake realized that the most important things, the things that truly mattered, were still within reach. If he could find the courage to fight for them, if he could prove that the man who had walked away was not the same man who had come home, if he could convince a woman he betrayed, and a child who didn't know him that he was worth the risk of believing in again. Tommy had grown restless in his mother's arms, his small hands reaching toward the ground with the universal toddler desire for freedom and exploration. Sarah set him down carefully, keeping one hand on his shoulder as he took unsteady steps toward the porch where his father knelt beside a dog who remembered better days. The child moved with the fearless curiosity of the very young, unaware of the complex adult emotions swirling around him. To Tommy, this was simply a new place to explore, a new person to meet, a friendly dog to pet. He approached Ranger with open hands and an open heart, the way children do before the world teaches them to be afraid. Ranger's tail wagged harder as the little boy drew near, his gentle nature asserting itself over any confusion or uncertainty. Dogs understand children in ways adults sometimes forget, and Ranger knew instinctively that this small human was precious, was connected to the man he loved, was deserving of protection and affection. Tommy's tiny fingers found Ranger's fur, burying themselves in the thick coat with delight. The dog held perfectly still, understanding the sacred trust being placed in him. Here was innocence, here was the future, here was everything worth protecting in the world. And Jake, watching his son meet his dog for the first time, felt something break open inside his chest. Not breaking apart, but breaking open like dawn breaks over the mountains, spilling light into places that had been dark for too long. This was his family, broken, scattered, wounded by his choices, but still his family. Still worth fighting for, still worth coming home to, even if home was nothing more than a borrowed cabin, and the hope that love could survive abandonment, that forgiveness could bloom in the ashes of trust burned away. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's weathered porch as Jake sat with his back against the wooden railing, watching Tommy chase butterflies in the small garden Sarah had planted behind the house. 3 days had passed since their reunion. 3 days of careful conversations and cautious glances, of boundaries being tested and trust being rebuilt, one fragile moment at a time. Ranger lay beside Jake, his graying muzzle resting on crossed paws, but his eyes never left the toddler who had quickly claimed a permanent place in the old dog's heart. Every few minutes, Tommy would toddle over to pat Ranger's head or whisper secrets into his ear, and the dog would thump his tail against the porch boards with quiet contentment. Sarah emerged from the cabin carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail she'd always favored for morning chores. She'd been up since dawn, as was her way, checking on the handful of horses she still boarded for neighboring ranchers, the small income that kept them afloat in this borrowed life. "He's got your stubborn streak," she said, settling beside Jake and handing him one of the mugs. "Spent 20 minutes yesterday trying to convince me that cookies count as breakfast food." Jake smiled, wrapping his fingers around the warm ceramic. "Sounds like solid logic to me. What did you tell him?" "That cookies are for after real food. But that may be, if he ate his eggs without complaining, we could make chocolate chip cookies together this afternoon." Sarah's voice carried the weary affection of a mother who'd learned to pick her battles carefully. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their son discover the world with the boundless energy of youth. Tommy had found a stick now and was conducting an elaborate orchestra of grasshoppers and morning birds, his serious expression suggesting this was important work indeed. "I got a job," Jake said finally, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Sarah turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her features. "Where?" "Morrison Construction. Tom Peterson called yesterday, said they could use an extra hand on the crew. It's not much, just general labor to start, but it's honest work." Jake took a sip of his coffee, savoring the familiar bitterness. "Tom remembers when I used to help my grandfather with fence repairs during summers. Says muscle memory counts for something." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Morrison Construction, named for Jake's great-grandfather who had started the company before focusing solely on ranching, now belonged to the Peterson family after Jake's grandfather had sold his share decades ago to focus on the land. But Tom Peterson was a good man, fair and decent, and he'd known Jake since childhood. "That's good," Sarah said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "Tom's always been solid. He'll treat you right." Jake nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Sarah, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but I need you to know something. I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm staying. I'm going to prove to you and to Tommy that I'm not the same man who walked away." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Tommy as he abandoned his stick orchestra in favor of examining a particularly interesting beetle. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured, like someone testing the strength of ice before stepping onto a frozen pond. "Jake, I want to believe you. God knows there's a part of me that never stopped wanting to believe you. But wanting something and trusting it are 2 different things." She turned to face him fully, her green eyes holding depths of pain he'd never seen before. "Do you know what it was like those first few months after you left? I kept telling myself you'd call, that you'd write, that you'd realize what you'd given up and come home." The words hit Jake like physical blows, each one a reminder of the selfishness that had driven his choices. He'd been so focused on his dreams, so convinced that love would wait while he conquered the world, that he'd never considered the daily reality of his absence. "I kept your coffee mug on the kitchen counter for 6 months, Sarah continued, her voice growing softer but no less intense. "Every morning I'd pour coffee for 2 out of habit, then stand there staring at that extra mug like an idiot. Ranger would sit by the door every evening around 5, waiting for the sound of your truck. He did that for almost a year, Jake. A whole year of false hope." Tommy had wandered closer during their conversation, drawn by the serious tone of their voices. He looked up at his parents with the intuitive wisdom children possess, sensing undercurrents he couldn't understand, but responding to them nonetheless. Without a word, he climbed onto Sarah's lap, pressing his small body against her chest in an offer of comfort. "And then I found out about Tommy," Sarah said, smoothing her son's golden curls with trembling fingers. "I was scared and sick and alone, and the one person who should have been there to hold my hand through it all was chasing spotlights in Los Angeles. Do you know how many nights I lay awake wondering if our baby would ever meet his father? If you'd even care that he existed?" Jake felt tears burning behind his eyes, the full weight of his abandonment finally settling on his shoulders like a yoke he'd been too proud to acknowledge. "Sarah, I'm not telling you this to hurt you," she interrupted gently. "I'm telling you because if we're going to move forward, if there's any chance for us to be a family, then you need to understand what that means. It means choosing us every single day, even when it's hard, even when something else seems more exciting or important. It means being present, not just physically, but emotionally. It means being the man Tommy can look up to, the man he can count on to be there when he needs you. Tommy had grown drowsy in his mother's arms, lulled by her rhythmic stroking of his hair and the warmth of her body. His thumb found its way to his mouth, a habit Sarah had been gently trying to break, but one she allowed now for the comfort it provided. "I want to be that man," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to be the father he deserves, the husband you deserve. I know I can't undo the past 3 years, can't give back what I took from you, but I can promise you my future. Every day of it for as long as you'll have me." Ranger lifted his head at the sound of Jake's voice, those intelligent brown eyes seeming to weigh his words along with his intentions. The dog had always been an excellent judge of character, and Jake found himself hoping for approval from this most loyal of friends. "Actions, Jake," Sarah said simply, "not words. Tommy and I have heard enough words to last a lifetime. We need to see what you're made of when the going gets tough, when the novelty wears off, when being a responsible father and partner isn't new and exciting anymore." A pickup truck rumbled up the gravel drive, interrupting their conversation. Tom Peterson climbed out of the cab, his weathered face breaking into a smile as he spotted them on the porch. He was a man in his 60s, built solid from decades of physical labor, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. "Morning, folks," Tom called, tipping his hat to Sarah. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Sarah replied, gently shifting Tommy to a more comfortable position as he dozed. "Can I get you some coffee?" "That's mighty kind, but I can't stay long. Just wanted to drop off some gear for Jake here, get him set up for tomorrow." Tom gestured toward the truck bed, which Jake could now see was loaded with a tool belt, hard hat, and work boots. "We're starting a new project out at the Henderson place, building a barn from the ground up. Good, honest work that'll put some calluses back on those city soft hands." Jake stood and walked to the truck, running his fingers over the leather tool belt with something approaching reverence. These were the tools of his grandfather's trade, the implements of men who built things that lasted, who created something meaningful with their hands and backs and determination. "Tom, I can't tell you how much this means," Jake began, but the older man waved off his gratitude. "Don't mention it. Your grandfather was one of the finest men I ever knew. Taught me half of what I know about construction and all of what I know about integrity. Figure I owe it to his memory to give his grandson a fair shake." Tom's expression grew serious. "But Jake, I'll be straight with you. I'm not doing this as charity. I need men who show up on time, work hard, and don't cause drama. You prove yourself reliable, and there's a place for you on my crew long term. You disappoint me, and you're gone." "Fair enough." "More than fair," Jake replied, strapping on the tool belt and adjusting it around his waist. The familiar weight felt right, felt like coming home to a part of himself he'd forgotten existed. "You won't regret this, Tom." "See that I don't." Tom climbed back into his truck, then paused with the door open. "Oh, and Jake? Your boy there is lucky to have you back. Don't make him wonder where his daddy is ever again." The truck pulled away, leaving dust and wisdom in its wake. Jake returned to the porch, the tool belt still around his waist, feeling more like himself than he had in years. Physical work, honest labor, the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. These were the things that had shaped him, the values his grandfather had instilled in him before foolish dreams had led him astray. Tommy had awakened during the conversation and was now studying Jake with curious eyes, taking in the tool belt and work boots with the fascination small children reserve for anything that looks official and important. "Daddy work?" Tommy asked, the word coming out clear and sweet and hitting Jake with the force of a lightning bolt. "Daddy." His son had called him Daddy, not from obligation or prompting, but from some instinctive recognition of their connection. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. It was the first time Tommy had used that word in Jake's presence, the first acknowledgement that he understood who this man was in his life. "Yes, buddy," Jake managed, kneeling down to Tommy's level. "Daddy's going to work. Daddy's going to build things and make money so we can take care of you and Mommy." Tommy reached out with small fingers to touch the hammer hanging from Jake's belt, his expression serious and contemplative. "Tommy help?" The innocent question brought tears to Jake's eyes. Here was his son, barely 2 years old, already wanting to work alongside his father, to be part of something bigger than himself. It was every man's dream and Jake's personal nightmare, knowing how close he'd come to missing it entirely. When you're bigger, buddy. When you're big enough to hold the tools safely, Daddy will teach you everything Grandpa Great taught me. We'll build things together, just you and me. Sarah watched this exchange with a mixture of hope and caution, her protective instincts warring with her desire to see her son have a relationship with his father. Tommy's happiness was her primary concern, but she couldn't deny the joy on the little boy's face as he interacted with Jake, the way he seemed to bloom under masculine attention and approval. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of domestic routine that felt both foreign and familiar to Jake. He helped Sarah with chores around the small property, his rusty skills gradually returning as he repaired a loose board on the chicken coop and fixed a stubborn gate latch that had been giving her trouble for weeks. Tommy shadowed their every move, chattering in the complex language of toddlers and offering assistance that usually involved more hindrance than help. But Jake found himself enchanted by every moment, storing up memories like a man hoarding gold. During Tommy's afternoon nap, Jake and Sarah sat on the front steps sharing a simple lunch of sandwiches and fruit. The conversation was easier now, more natural, as if the morning's honest exchange had cleared some invisible barrier between them. "I've been thinking about what happens when the month is up," Sarah said, biting into an apple with a soft crunch. "When we have to leave the cabin." Jake had been dreading this conversation, knowing it was inevitable, but hoping to postpone it until he had more concrete answers to offer. "I've been thinking about that too. I don't have much saved up yet, but maybe we could rent something small in town, just temporarily while I get back on my feet financially." Sarah shook her head slowly. "Jake, there is no we, not yet. Tommy and I will figure something out, but you need to understand that living together, being a family again, that's not something I'm ready for. It's going to take time to rebuild that kind of trust." The words stung, but Jake recognized the wisdom in them. Sarah was protecting herself and their son from further heartbreak, establishing boundaries that he had no right to question. If he wanted to earn his place back in their lives, it would have to be through patience and consistency, not assumptions or demands. "I understand," he said quietly, "but I want to help, however I can. Even if we're not living together, I want to contribute to Tommy's care, be involved in his life. I want to be a real father to him, not just someone who sends a check once a month." "Then prove it," Sarah challenged, but her tone was gentle rather than harsh. "Show me you can be reliable, that you can put his needs before your own wants. Show me you understand what being a parent really means." That evening, as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake found himself alone with Tommy for the first time. Sarah had driven into town for supplies, trusting him with their son for the 2 hours the errand would take. They sat together on the porch swing his grandfather had built decades ago, Tommy curled against Jake's chest while Ranger dozed at their feet. The toddler was fighting sleep, his small fists rubbing at his eyes even as he insisted he wasn't tired. "Tell story," Tommy mumbled, his thumb creeping toward his mouth. Jake's mind raced, trying to remember the stories his own grandfather had told him during countless evenings, just like this one. Tales of brave cowboys and loyal horses, of storms weathered and challenges overcome, of the satisfaction that came from honest work and simple living. "Once upon a time," Jake began, his voice soft and rhythmic, "there was a cowboy who loved his horse more than anything in the whole world. They traveled everywhere together, through desert and mountain, through sunshine and storm." Tommy's breathing began to slow, his small body relaxing completely against his father's chest. Jake continued the story, weaving together fragments of memory and imagination, creating a tale of adventure and loyalty, of mistakes made and redemption earned. As he spoke, Jake felt something settle inside him, a sense of rightness he hadn't experienced in years. This was where he belonged, not on a stage in front of strangers, but here on this porch with his son in his arms and his dog at his feet, telling stories that would someday become precious memories. When Sarah returned from town, she found them still on the swing, both father and son fast asleep in the gathering dusk. Tommy's head rested on Jake's shoulder, while Jake's cheek pressed against his son's golden curls. Ranger had moved closer, positioning himself as a protective barrier between his family and the world. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The road would be long and difficult. Paved with a broken trust, Jake would have to rebuild stone by stone. But looking at her son's peaceful face, at the contentment radiating from this simple scene, she began to believe that some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth the risk of believing in again. The first week of work nearly broke Jake in ways he hadn't expected. His body, soft from 3 years of city living, screamed in protest as he hauled lumber and mixed concrete under the relentless Montana sun. Blisters formed on his palms despite the work gloves, and muscles he'd forgotten he possessed ached with each movement. But it was good pain, honest pain, the kind that reminded him he was rebuilding more than just barns. Tom Peterson watched him carefully those first few days, saying little but missing nothing. Jake could feel the older man's eyes on him as he struggled with tasks that should have been second nature, as he fumbled with tools he'd once wielded with confidence. There were no second chances here, no room for the kind of mistakes that ego and impatience created. On Thursday morning, Jake arrived at the Henderson property to find the crew already gathered around Tom's truck, their faces grim. Bad news traveled fast in small communities, and Jake felt his stomach drop as he approached the group. "Henderson's backing out," Tom announced without preamble. "Says he can't afford the project anymore, something about unexpected medical bills for his wife. We're out of work until I can line up the next job." The other men dispersed quickly, heading home to break the news to their own families. Jake remained behind, panic rising in his throat. He'd been counting on this income, had already calculated how many weeks it would take to save enough for a security deposit on a small apartment where he could prove his stability to Sarah. "Tom, I need this job," Jake said, trying to keep desperation out of his voice. "Isn't there something else? Anything else I could do?" The older man studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward his own truck. "Get in. There might be something." They drove in silence through town and out toward the foothills, where sprawling ranch properties gave way to smaller homesteads and hobby farms. Tom finally pulled into the driveway of a modest house with a sagging front porch and a yard full of projects in various states of completion. "This is my place," Tom explained as they climbed out. "Been meaning to tackle some of these repairs for months, but between running the business and helping my daughter with her new baby, I never seem to find the time. You interested in some side work? Won't pay as much as the crew job, but it's steady." Jake looked around at the obvious signs of deferred maintenance, the loose shutters and warped deck boards, the fence that leaned precariously toward the neighbor's property. Here was work that mattered, improvements that would make a real difference in someone's daily life. "I'm interested," he said firmly. "What do you need me to start with?" Tom smiled for the first time that morning. "How about we begin with that porch? My wife's been after me to fix those steps for 2 years now. Says she's going to break her neck one of these days, and knowing Martha, she's probably right." They spent the morning assessing the damage and planning the repairs. Jake found himself falling into a rhythm he remembered from childhood summers, when his grandfather had patiently taught him the difference between work done fast and work done right. Measure twice, cut once. Take pride in the details no one else will see. Build things to last beyond your own lifetime. By noon, they had torn out the rotted boards and begun installing the replacement lumber. Jake's hands moved with increasing confidence, muscle memory overriding the uncertainty that had plagued him all week. This was honest work, meaningful work, the kind that connected a man to something larger than himself. "You know," Tom said during their lunch break, "your grandfather would be proud of what you're doing. Coming home, facing your mistakes, working to make things right. That takes a special kind of courage." Jake looked up from his sandwich, surprised by the unexpected praise. "I don't feel very courageous. Most days I feel like I'm just trying not to screw up worse than I already have." "That's exactly what courage is," Tom replied with a chuckle. "It's not the absence of fear, son. It's doing what needs to be done, despite the fear." Your grandfather understood that better than most. The afternoon passed quickly as they worked side by side, the companionable silence broken only by requests for tools or brief discussions about technique. Jake found himself thinking about Tommy, imagining a future where he could teach his son these same skills, pass on the legacy of craftsmanship that connected generations of Morrison men. When 5 o'clock arrived, Tom surveyed their progress with satisfaction. The new porch steps were solid and square, built to withstand decades of use. More importantly, Jake had proven he could complete a project from start to finish, that his commitment to quality work extended beyond the presence of a supervisor. "Same time tomorrow?" Tom asked, gathering his tools. "I'll be here," Jake promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. The drive back to the cabin gave Jake time to process the day's events, to recognize that sometimes setbacks could become opportunities if you were willing to adapt. The Henderson job falling through had been devastating news that morning, but it had led to something potentially more valuable, work that allowed him to rebuild his skills while contributing to his community. He found Sarah in the garden behind the cabin, Tommy toddling between the vegetable rows with a small watering can that was more decorative than functional. The sight of them together, golden in the late afternoon light, made Jake's chest to tighten with love and longing. "How was work?" Sarah asked, not looking up from the tomato plants she was staking. "Different than expected," Jake replied, settling on the ground beside Tommy and accepting the watering can the boy thrust toward him. "The Henderson job fell through, but Tom offered me some side work at his place. Steady income, just not as much as I'd hoped." He could see the concern flicker across Sarah's features. The automatic calculation of bills and expenses that single mothers learn to do without thinking. Money was always tight, always a source of worry, and Jake's reduced income would affect them all. "It's something," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Building back up is going to take time." Tommy had discovered a caterpillar making its way across a lettuce leaf and was conducting a serious conversation with the creature about its travel plans. His absorption in this tiny drama reminded Jake of the wonder he'd once felt exploring this same garden as a child, when every bug and bird had been a source of fascination. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said, about proving myself through actions rather than words. I want to start a college fund for Tommy. It won't be much at first, maybe $20 or $30 a week, but it's something. A promise that I'm planning for his future, that I'm going to be around to see him grow up." Sarah's hands stilled on the tomato vines, her eyes searching his face for signs of sincerity or empty gesture. What she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "That would be good," she said simply. "He's going to need every advantage we can give him." They spent the evening as they had begun to every evening, sharing a simple dinner and the daily rituals of family life. Jake helped with Tommy's bath, marveling at the trust the little boy showed as he played with his floating toys and chattered about his day. Bedtime stories had become Jake's responsibility, a sacred time when father and son connected through tales of adventure and imagination. But tonight, as Jake tucked Tommy into his small bed and kissed his forehead goodnight, the boy grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "Daddy, stay?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide and serious in the dim light of the bedroom. The question hit Jake like a physical blow, carrying within it all the uncertainty and hope of a child who was just beginning to understand that the adults in his life could disappear without warning. How do you explain to a 2-year-old that love doesn't always mean living in the same house, that sometimes the people who care about you most have to earn the right to stay? "Daddy's not going anywhere, buddy," Jake whispered, smoothing the golden curls away from Tommy's forehead. "Even when I'm not sleeping here, I'm always going to be your daddy. Always going to love you and take care of you. That's a promise." Tommy seemed to consider this, his thumb finding its way to his mouth as sleep began to claim him. Within minutes, his breathing had evened out, and Jake found himself standing in the doorway just watching his son sleep, memorizing every detail of this perfect, peaceful moment. Sarah was waiting for him on the front porch when he emerged from the cabin, 2 cups of tea steaming in the cool evening air. They sat together on the steps listening to the night sounds of the Montana countryside, the distant call of coyotes and the rustle of wind through the aspens. "He's getting attached to you," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying both joy and concern. "More every day. I can see it in the way he looks for you when he wakes up, the way he saves his best smiles for when you come home from work." Jake sipped his tea, choosing his words carefully. "Is that a bad thing?" "It could be," Sarah replied honestly. "If you're not ready for what that means." Children don't understand complicated adult emotions, Jake. To Tommy, you're either here or you're not. You either keep your promises or you break them. There's no middle ground in a child's heart. The weight of that responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders, like a mantle he'd been avoiding for too long. Tommy's love was pure and unconditional, offered freely without reservation or protection. It was a gift Jake didn't deserve, but one he was determined to prove worthy of. "I know the stakes," he said quietly. "I know what I'm asking you to risk by trusting me with his heart. But Sarah, I swear to you, I would rather die than hurt that little boy the way I hurt you. He's going to be able to count on me every single day for the rest of his life." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Jake found himself thinking about his grandfather, about the lessons in responsibility and commitment that he'd been too young and foolish to fully appreciate. Family wasn't just blood and genetics. It was choice and dedication, the daily decision to put someone else's needs before your own wants. The weekend brought new challenges and small victories. Saturday morning found Jake helping Sarah move the last of her possessions out of the main ranch house, which the new owners wanted cleared before the final transfer of property. It was heartbreaking work, packing away the memories of 4 generations of Morrison family life. Tommy toddled through the empty rooms with wide eyes, his small voice echoing off bare walls as he called for the familiar objects that had defined his world. His toy box, his high chair, the rocking horse Jake's grandfather had carved by hand, all of it disappeared into cardboard boxes like a life being erased. "I'm sorry," Jake said as they loaded the last box into Sarah's truck. "I'm sorry you had to go through this alone. Sorry I wasn't here to fight for what was ours." Sarah paused in securing the tailgate, her hands gripping the metal edge with white knuckles. "The fighting was over long before the auction, Jake. The bills, the mortgage payments, the taxes, they all kept coming whether you were here or not. I did the best I could, but one person can't save a place this size alone." The truth of her words cut deep, but Jake forced himself to accept them without argument or excuse. He had abandoned not just his family, but his responsibilities, leaving Sarah to carry burdens that should have been shared. The ranch was gone, sold to pay debts that his absence had made impossible to manage, and no amount of regret could change that reality. But as they drove away from the house where Jake had learned to walk and dream and love, he made himself a promise. Someday, somehow, he would build something lasting for his son. Maybe not the generational legacy his grandfather had created, but something solid and permanent that Tommy could depend on. Something that would teach the boy about roots and responsibility and the satisfaction of honest work. Sunday brought an unexpected visitor to the cabin. Jake was outside splitting firewood for the coming winter when a familiar car pulled into the driveway. His mother climbed out slowly, her movements careful and deliberate in the way of someone who had aged beyond her years. Helen Morrison had been beautiful once, before grief and worry had carved lines around her eyes and turned her hair silver before its time. She'd buried her husband when Jake was 15, raised him alone while trying to keep the ranch afloat, and watched her only child walk away from everything she'd sacrificed to preserve. "Hello, Jacob," she said formally, her voice carrying 3 years of hurt and disappointment. "Mom." The word came out rough and uncertain. They hadn't spoken since the day he left, their relationship another casualty of his selfish choices. Sarah appeared in the cabin doorway with Tommy in her arms, the little boy's face lighting up at the sight of his grandmother. "Grandma Helen!" he squealed, reaching out with eager arms. Helen's stern expression melted instantly as she gathered her grandson into a fierce embrace. Here was unconditional love, uncomplicated by adult mistakes and broken promises. Tommy had been the bright spot in Helen's life during Jake's absence, the reason she got up each morning, the hope that kept her fighting through dark nights and lonely days. "There's my beautiful boy," she murmured, covering Tommy's face with gentle kisses. "Have you been good for Mommy? Have you been helping take care of the chickens?" Tommy launched into an enthusiastic recounting of his daily adventures, his words tumbling over each other in excitement. Helen listened with the patience of someone who understood that children's stories were precious gifts, windows into hearts that hadn't yet learned to hide their truth. Jake watched this reunion with a mixture of joy and shame, grateful that his son had this connection to his heritage, while painfully aware of the relationship he'd destroyed through his own choices. Helen had been a good mother, devoted and sacrificing, and he'd repaid her love with abandonment and silence. When Tommy finally ran off to show Ranger a particularly interesting rock he'd discovered, Helen turned her attention to her son. The warmth she'd shown her grandson was replaced by cool assessment, the look of someone deciding whether to trust again. "Sarah told me you were back," she said simply. "I'm back," Jake confirmed, unsure what else to say. "For how long this time?" The question was fair but painful, a reminder that his word had lost all value through his previous actions. How do you convince someone who raised you that you finally learned the lessons she tried to teach you years too late? "Forever," Jake said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "I'm not leaving again, Mom. I can't undo the past 3 years, can't give back what I took from all of you, but I can promise you my future." Helen studied his face for a long moment, searching for signs of the boy she'd raised, the man she'd hoped he would become. What she saw there must have been enough, because her expression softened slightly. "Words are easy, Jacob. Your grandfather used to say that a man's character isn't measured by his intentions but by his actions when no one is watching. You've got a lot of proving to do, to all of us." "I know," Jake replied humbly. "I'm ready to do the work." Helen nodded slowly, then surprised him by stepping forward and pulling him into a brief, fierce hug. It was forgiveness offered cautiously, love extended despite disappointment, hope kindled despite past betrayals. "Good," she whispered against his ear. "Because that little boy needs his father, and Sarah needs a partner she can count on. Don't let us down again, son. We won't survive it a second time." 6 weeks into his return, Jake faced his first real test. Tommy had developed a fever during the night, his small body burning with heat that sent Sarah into the controlled panic every parent knows. By morning, the little boy was listless and crying, refusing food and clinging to his mother with desperate need. "We need to get him to the doctor," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry as she gathered Tommy's things. Her hands shook slightly as she packed the diaper bag, muscle memory from countless nights when she'd handled these crises alone. Jake watched her efficient movements, recognizing the signs of someone who had learned to be self-reliant out of necessity. For 3 years, every decision, every emergency, every moment of fear had been hers to face without backup or support. He understood now what that kind of isolation could do to a person, how it built walls that were hard to tear down even when help finally arrived. "I'll drive," Jake offered, grabbing his keys. It was a small gesture, but one that carried weight beyond its simplicity. Sarah paused, considered, then nodded. The 40-minute drive to town passed in tense silence, broken only by Tommy's occasional whimpers from his car seat. Jake found himself gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, fighting the urge to speed as helplessness clawed at his chest. This was what parenthood really meant, he realized. Not the sweet bedtime stories or morning giggles, but this raw terror that something might happen to the most precious thing in your world. At the clinic, they waited in the pediatric area, surrounded by other worried parents and fussy children. Tommy had fallen into a restless sleep against Sarah's shoulder, his breathing shallow and rapid. Jake sat beside them, feeling useless and inexperienced, watching Sarah's practiced calm while his own anxiety threatened to consume him. "First fever?" asked an older woman across from them, her own toddler sleeping fitfully in her lap. "For him," Sarah replied, gesturing toward Jake. "I've been through this before." The woman smiled knowingly. "It never gets easier, the worry. But you learn to trust yourself. Trust that you'll know what to do when it matters." When Dr. Martinez finally called them back, Jake felt his heart racing as if he were the one being examined. The pediatrician was gentle and thorough, her experienced hands checking Tommy's ears, throat, and lymph nodes, while he whimpered softly against Sarah's chest. "Just a virus," Dr. Martinez announced after her examination. "His ears look good, throat's a little red, but nothing serious. Keep him hydrated. Alternate acetaminophen and ibuprofen for the fever, and he should be feeling better in a few days." The relief that washed over Jake was so intense it made him dizzy. Such a simple diagnosis, such common childhood illness, but the fear had been real and overwhelming. He began to understand the constant, low-level anxiety that came with loving someone so completely vulnerable, so dependent on your protection and care. On the drive home, Tommy fell into a deeper sleep, his fever already responding to the medication. Sarah seemed to relax for the first time all day, the tension leaving her shoulders as crisis passed into manageable illness. "Thank you," she said quietly, not looking at Jake but meaning it. "For being here, for helping. I forgot what it felt like to not handle everything alone." Jake wanted to say that she'd never have to handle anything alone again, but the words felt too big, too presumptuous for where they stood in their fragile reconciliation. Instead, he reached over and squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity and support that needed no promises or declarations. The next 3 days tested Jake in ways he hadn't anticipated. Tommy was clingy and miserable, wanting only his mother but gradually accepting his father's comfort when Sarah needed breaks. Jake learned the particular exhaustion that comes from caring for a sick child, the way worry amplifies every sound, every change in breathing, every rise and fall of temperature. He took time off from Tom's projects without being asked, choosing his son's needs over his own financial concerns. Sarah noticed this choice, the way Jake prioritized family over work without making it seem like a sacrifice or seeking credit for doing what needed to be done. When Tommy finally turned the corner, giggling weakly at Ranger's gentle attempts to cheer him up, Jake felt like he'd passed some invisible test. Not just in Sarah's eyes, but in his own understanding of what commitment really meant. The experience had bonded them in unexpected ways. Sarah began including Jake in more decisions about Tommy's care, asking his opinion about bedtime routines and meal choices. Small things, but signals that she was beginning to see him as a true partner in parenting, rather than just a well-meaning visitor. One evening, as they sat watching Tommy play with his blocks while Ranger supervised from nearby, Sarah broke the comfortable silence with words that changed everything. "I found us a place," she said, not looking at Jake. "A small apartment above the bakery in town. Mrs. Henderson is renting it out, and she likes Tommy. We can move in next week." Jake felt his heart sink even as he recognized the necessity of her decision. The month at the cabin was nearly up, and they needed somewhere stable to live. But the thought of Sarah and Tommy moving away, of losing these daily moments of family life, was almost unbearable. "That's good," he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "Mrs. Henderson's nice. Tommy will like being able to smell fresh bread every morning." Sarah glanced at him then, perhaps hearing something in his tone that made her soften her next words. "It's not permanent, Jake. Just temporary, until I can save enough for something better. And it doesn't change anything between us, the progress we've been making. But it did change things, and they both knew it. The forced intimacy of sharing the cabin, the natural rhythms of family life they'd been rebuilding, would be lost. Jake would go back to being a visitor in his son's life, someone who came for scheduled visits rather than someone who was simply there. "I want to help with the rent," Jake said, the words coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. "I know I don't have much saved yet, but whatever I can contribute, I want to help." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy stack blocks with the intense concentration only toddlers could achieve. "We're not ready for that kind of financial entanglement, Jake. Not yet. I need to know I can take care of us on my own before I start depending on help that might disappear." The words stung because they were fair, because Jake had forfeited the right to be depended upon through his previous choices. But they also motivated him in ways mere guilt never could. Sarah needed to see that he was reliable, not just emotionally, but practically, financially, in all the ways that mattered when you were raising a child. That weekend, Jake threw himself into finishing Tom's projects with renewed intensity. Every board he measured, every nail he drove, was another step toward proving his worth as a provider and protector. Tom noticed the change in his energy, the way Jake attacked each task with focused determination. "You're pushing yourself pretty hard," Tom observed as they took a break from installing new kitchen cabinets. "Something driving you?" Jake wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, considering how much to share. Tom had become more than just an employer over the past month. He'd become a mentor and friend, someone whose opinion mattered. "Sarah and Tommy are moving to their own place next week," Jake explained. "I want to be able to contribute more, help with expenses, show her I'm serious about being a real partner in raising Tommy." Tom nodded thoughtfully, then surprised Jake with his next words. "You know, I've been thinking about expanding the business, been getting more calls than I can handle on my own, especially with the housing development going up north of town. Could use a reliable foreman, someone who knows quality work and can manage a crew." Jake's heart leaped at the implication, but he forced himself to stay calm. What kind of position are you thinking about? Full-time, benefits, significant increase in pay. But it would mean real responsibility, Jake. Scheduling jobs, managing materials, making sure projects come in on time and on budget. I'd be trusting you with my reputation, my relationships with clients. The opportunity was more than Jake had dared hope for. A chance to rebuild not just his finances, but his professional standing in the community. It was also terrifying. The weight of others' expectations settling on shoulders that had buckled under pressure before. I won't let you down, Jake said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. I know you won't, Tom replied with quiet confidence, because this time you understand what you've got to lose. That evening, Jake shared the news with Sarah as they packed the last of her belongings into boxes. She paused in wrapping dishes, a smile breaking across her face for the first time in days. Jake, that's wonderful. Tom wouldn't offer that kind of position to someone he didn't trust completely. You should be proud. I am, Jake admitted. Scared, but proud. It means I can help more, contribute to Tommy's expenses, maybe even start saving for a place of our own someday. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. A place of our own. The assumption that they would eventually be together, that this careful rebuilding would lead to something permanent and whole. Sarah didn't contradict him, but she didn't encourage the dream either. Instead, she returned to her packing, wrapping each dish with careful attention, as if the simple task could provide clarity for more complex emotions. Moving day arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that seemed designed to make transitions feel more difficult than they needed to be. Jake arrived early to help load Sarah's truck, his arms full of boxes while Ranger followed hopefully behind, as if understanding that something significant was happening. Tommy sensed the disruption too, clinging to his mother and crying whenever she set him down. The little boy had grown attached to the cabin, to the routine they'd established, to having his father present for bedtime stories and morning breakfast. Change was hard for everyone, but especially difficult for someone too young to understand the reasons behind it. It's okay, buddy, Jake soothed, lifting Tommy into his arms while Sarah finished loading the last box. Mommy's new place is going to be great, and Daddy will still see you all the time, still read you stories, and help you feed the chickens at Grandma Helen's. Tommy's tears slowed as Jake spoke, his small hands gripping his father's shirt with desperate trust. Daddy come too? The question broke Jake's heart all over again, the simple faith of a child who couldn't understand why the people he loved most couldn't all live in the same place. How do you explain adult complications to someone who sees the world in terms of hugs and bedtime stories? Not yet, son, Jake said gently, but Daddy will visit lots, and maybe someday when Mommy's ready, we can all live together again. Sarah heard this exchange as she secured the truck's tailgate, her expression unreadable. Jake wondered if he'd overstepped, made promises he had no right to make, but she said nothing as they caravaned toward town. The apartment above Henderson's bakery was small but clean, with large windows that let in plenty of light and the constant, comforting smell of fresh bread from below. Mrs. Henderson had prepared it carefully, understanding that a young mother and her toddler needed safety and stability above all else. Jake spent the afternoon helping Sarah unpack and arrange furniture, creating a home from the scattered pieces of their former life. Tommy explored every corner with the resilience of childhood, already adapting to this new space with the flexibility that adults envied but could rarely match. As evening approached and the last box was emptied, Jake found himself reluctant to leave. This felt like an ending, the close of a chapter that had been painful but necessary, full of small victories and tentative hope. I should go, he said finally, gathering his tools and jacket. Jake. Sarah's voice stopped him at the door. Thank you for helping today, for being patient with all of this, for understanding why I need to do things this way. He turned to face her, seeing something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The recognition that what they were building together might actually have a foundation strong enough to last. I understand, he said simply. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. As Jake drove back to the empty cabin for his last night there, Ranger beside him in the truck, he felt the weight of transition settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow he would start his new position with Tom, would begin the process of rebuilding his professional life while continuing to prove himself as a father and potential partner. The road ahead was uncertain, marked by challenges he couldn't yet imagine and tests he might not pass. But for the first time since returning home, Jake felt genuinely hopeful about the future. He had work that mattered, a son who loved him, and a woman who was beginning to trust him again. Most importantly, he had finally learned the difference between wanting something and being willing to do the daily work required to earn it. Love wasn't a feeling that sustained itself. It was a choice made new each morning, a commitment proven through actions when words failed. And Jake Morrison was finally ready to make that choice, every day, for the rest of his life. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Montana in snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something both beautiful and challenging. Jake had been in his foreman position for 3 months, and the increased responsibility had tested him in ways that went far beyond his technical skills. Managing crews meant navigating personalities, solving problems on the fly, and making decisions that affected both budgets and relationships. The morning everything changed started like any other. Jake arrived at the Riverside housing development at 6:30, the sky still dark and the temperature hovering near zero. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he unlocked the construction trailer and began reviewing the day's schedule. 12 houses in various stages of completion, 2 crews working on foundations despite the cold, and a delivery of materials that was already running late. By 8 o'clock, Jake's carefully planned schedule had crumbled. The concrete truck broke down halfway to the site, leaving the foundation crew with nothing to do. The heating system in house number 7 had malfunctioned overnight, freezing the pipes and creating a mess that would take hours to clean up. And Miguel Santos, one of his most reliable workers, called in sick for the 3rd day in a row. Jake stood in the trailer, surrounded by schedules and supply lists and phone messages, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. 3 months ago, he would have panicked, would have seen these setbacks as personal failures rather than normal challenges of construction work. But time and experience had taught him that problems were simply puzzles waiting to be solved. He called Tom first, explaining the concrete situation and requesting backup equipment. Then he reassigned the foundation crew to interior work on house number 4, where they could stay warm while maintaining productivity. The frozen pipe situation required a plumber, but Jake knew a temporary solution that would get them through the day until professional help arrived. By noon, what had started as a disaster had been transformed into merely an inconvenience. The concrete arrived via backup truck, the foundation crew had completed drywall installation ahead of schedule, and the temporary heating fix was holding steady. Tom arrived for his routine inspection to find the project running smoothly despite the morning's chaos. "How did you handle the concrete delay?" Tom asked, reviewing Jake's incident report with obvious interest. "Rescheduled the pour for tomorrow morning, moved the crew to interior work where they could stay productive in the warm. Sometimes flexibility is more valuable than sticking to the original plan," Jake explained, his confidence evident in the straightforward way he described his problem-solving process. Tom nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said that real craftsmen aren't the ones who never encounter problems, but the ones who solve them without making excuses." The praise meant more to Jake than any raise or bonus could have. He was beginning to understand that rebuilding his life wasn't just about making amends for past mistakes. It was about becoming the man he'd always had the potential to be, the man his family needed him to be. That evening, Jake stopped by Sarah's apartment, as had become his routine 3 nights a week. These visits had evolved into something comfortable and natural, time spent helping Tommy with simple puzzles while Sarah cooked dinner, reading bedtime stories, and sharing the small details of daily life that connected families together. Tonight felt different, though. Sarah seemed distracted during dinner, responding to Tommy's chatter with automatic smiles while her mind was clearly elsewhere. When Jake offered to clean up the dishes, she accepted gratefully, disappearing into the bedroom to take a phone call that stretched on for nearly an hour. Tommy, sensing his mother's preoccupation, became clingy and demanding, refusing to play with his toys and insisting that Jake carry him everywhere. The little boy's emotional radar was finely tuned to adult moods, and Sarah's tension had infected the entire evening. When Sarah finally emerged from the bedroom, her face was pale and drawn. She sank onto the couch beside Jake and Tommy, who immediately scrambled into her lap, seeking the comfort only mothers could provide. "That was Dr. Peterson," Sarah said quietly, her voice carefully controlled. "Tommy's pediatrician. She wants to run some additional tests." Jake felt his heart stop, the casual normalcy of the evening shattered by words that carried the weight of every parent's worst fears. "What kind of tests?" "Blood work, mostly. She's concerned about some things she noticed during his last checkup. His energy levels, some swelling in his lymph nodes that hasn't gone down. She says it's probably nothing, just wants to be thorough, but—" Sarah's voice trailed off as she pressed her face against Tommy's hair. The "but" hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities that neither wanted to acknowledge. Jake reached over and placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder, feeling the tremor of fear running through her entire body. "When?" he asked simply. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock at the clinic. Then we drive to Billings for the more specialized tests. She's arranged for us to see a pediatric hematologist at the children's hospital." Sarah's voice broke slightly on the last words, the clinical terminology making the situation feel more real and more terrifying. Jake's mind raced through the implications. Tomorrow was Friday, a critical day for the housing project, with concrete pours scheduled at 2 different sites. His crew was counting on him to coordinate deliveries and oversee quality control. Tom was depending on him to manage the day's complex logistics without supervision. But looking at his son's innocent face, at the trust in those bright eyes, Jake realized there was no choice to be made. Some things mattered more than work, more than proving himself professionally, more than any commitment, except the one to family. "I'm coming with you," Jake said, the words spoken with quiet certainty that left no room for argument. Sarah looked up at him, surprise flickering across her features. "Jake, you don't have to. I know work is important, and I've handled doctor appointments alone before." "You're not alone anymore," Jake replied firmly. "Not with this. Not with anything that involves Tommy. I'm calling Tom tonight, explaining the situation. The crew can handle one day without me, but my son needs his father." The simple declaration seemed to break something loose in Sarah's carefully maintained composure. Tears she'd been holding back since the phone call began to flow. 3 years of single motherhood and solitary worry finally finding release in the presence of someone who truly understood the stakes. Jake pulled both Sarah and Tommy into his arms, holding them while Sarah cried and Tommy played with the buttons on his father's shirt, blissfully unaware that his world might be about to change in ways no 2-year-old should have to understand. They spent that night together, all 3 of them curled up on Sarah's small couch, afraid to sleep, afraid to let go of each other, afraid to think too far ahead into a future that might demand more courage than they possessed. Ranger, who had followed Jake to the apartment, settled on the floor beside them, his protective instincts sensing the family's need for his steadying presence. The morning dawned gray and cold, matching the somber mood that had settled over them like a shroud. Tommy was fussy and tired, sensing the adult's anxiety even if he couldn't understand its source. Getting him dressed and fed required patience none of them really felt, but they managed through teamwork and the kind of gentle persistence that parenting demanded even in crisis. The drive to Billings took 2 hours through snow-covered highways that seemed to stretch endlessly toward an uncertain destination. Tommy slept in his car seat for most of the journey, exhausted by the early morning and the emotional undercurrents he couldn't name but definitely felt. Jake drove while Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her hands twisted together in her lap, occasionally reaching back to touch Tommy's foot or adjust his blanket. They spoke little during the drive, both lost in thoughts too frightening to voice, both trying to project strength they didn't entirely feel. The pediatric wing of St. Vincent Healthcare was decorated with cheerful murals and colorful furniture designed to minimize the institutional feel that could terrify young patients. But no amount of decoration could disguise the underlying reality of what this place represented, the battles fought here against diseases and conditions that had no business attacking children. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the pediatric hematologist, was younger than Jake had expected, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who had delivered both devastating news and miraculous recoveries. Her manner was gentle but direct as she explained the tests Tommy would undergo, the timeline for results, and the range of possibilities they were investigating. The good news is that most of the time, These symptoms have completely benign explanations, Dr. Chen said, her voice kind but professional. Children Tommy's age can show enlarged lymph nodes for dozens of reasons, most of them temporary and harmless. But we want to rule out the more serious possibilities so we can treat anything we find as early as possible. Tommy was remarkably brave during the blood draws, crying briefly but calming quickly when Jake made silly faces and Sarah sang his favorite lullaby. The little boy's resilience amazed both parents, his ability to bounce back from discomfort and return to playing with the toy dinosaur Dr. Chen had given him. The waiting was the hardest part. 4 hours in a pediatric oncology waiting room, surrounded by other families facing their own uncertainties, watching children who were clearly fighting battles no child should have to fight. Jake found himself studying the faces of other parents, seeing in their expressions the same mixture of hope and terror that he felt consuming his own heart. Sarah spent the time making lists, her nervous energy channeled into organizing thoughts and possibilities on paper. Treatment options, insurance questions, work schedule adjustments, all the practical considerations that would need addressing regardless of what the test results revealed. When Dr. Chen finally called them back into her office, Jake felt his stomach drop toward his shoes. The doctor's expression was carefully neutral, giving no hints about what she was about to tell them. Sarah gripped Jake's hand so tightly he lost feeling in his fingers, but he welcomed the pain as a distraction from the fear. "The test results are encouraging," Dr. Chen began, and Jake felt the world start spinning again after hours of holding his breath. Tommy's blood work shows no signs of leukemia or lymphoma. His white cell count is slightly elevated, consistent with his body fighting off a lingering viral infection. The lymph node swelling appears to be a normal immune response rather than anything sinister. The relief that washed over Jake was so intense it made him lightheaded. Sarah began crying again, but these were tears of gratitude rather than fear, the release of tension that had been building since yesterday's phone call. "What does this mean going forward?" Sarah managed to ask through her tears. "We'll want to monitor Tommy for the next few weeks. Make sure the lymph nodes continue to reduce in size as the infection clears. But I expect him to make a complete recovery with no long-term effects. He's a healthy, strong little boy who just happened to catch a particularly stubborn virus." The drive home felt like a celebration, even though Tommy slept through most of it and Sarah dozed fitfully in the passenger seat. Jake found himself singing along to the radio, overwhelmed with gratitude for ordinary health, for normal childhood illnesses, for the privilege of worrying about mundane problems rather than life-threatening diagnoses. When they arrived back at Sarah's apartment that evening, exhausted but relieved, Jake helped carry a sleeping Tommy upstairs and tuck him into his own bed. The little boy stirred briefly as his father kissed his forehead, mumbling something about dinosaurs before settling back into peaceful sleep. In the kitchen, Sarah made tea while Jake called Tom to report that everything was fine, that he'd be back to work on Monday ready to tackle whatever challenges the housing project might present. Tom's relief was evident in his voice, the worry of a man who had come to care about Jake's family as if they were his own. "Thank you," Sarah said as they sat together at her small kitchen table, steam rising from their cups in the lamplight. "For today, for being there, for choosing us over work when it really mattered." Jake reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. "There was no choice to make, Sarah. Tommy is my son, you're the woman I love, and family always comes first. Always." The words hung in the air between them, the first time Jake had spoken of love since his return, the first acknowledgement of what they were both beginning to feel as they rebuilt their relationship from the ground up. Sarah didn't reply immediately, but she didn't pull her hand away either. Instead, she studied his face in the soft light, searching for the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. The man she was beginning to trust might actually be real this time. "I'm not ready to say that back yet," she said finally, her honesty both painful and appreciated. "But I'm not ready either, if that makes sense. Today showed me something about who you've become, about what you're willing to sacrifice for us. That matters, Jake. It matters more than words." Jake nodded, understanding that some gifts couldn't be rushed, that trust and love were earned through actions consistently applied over time. Today had been a test he hadn't known he was taking, but one that might have moved them closer to the future he dreamed of every night. As he drove home through the dark Montana countryside, Ranger sleeping peacefully beside him, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few months. The crisis had reminded him what truly mattered, had shown him that success wasn't measured in dollars earned or professional achievements unlocked, but in being present when the people you loved needed you most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, both at work and in his ongoing effort to prove himself worthy of the family he'd abandoned and found again. But tonight, his son was healthy, the woman he loved was beginning to trust him again, and Jake Morrison finally understood what it meant to be the man his grandfather had tried to teach him to become. Some lessons, he realized, could only be learned through living them, through making mistakes and finding the courage to do better. The cowboy who had ridden away chasing foolish dreams was gone forever, replaced by a man who understood that the greatest adventures happened not on distant stages, but in the daily choice to love and protect and provide for the people who made life worth living. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.